Well, first of all, I'd like to make it clear that I'm not an art historian and that I probably know less about art than the average person. Secondly, I'd like to apologise for not giving a talk, but instead I shall be reading a paper. Although I think talks are much easier to listen to, I'm more used to the paper format, and it's also the case that some of the material that I shall be dealing with calls for more precise language. However, to help compensate for this, I should be quite happy for people to interrupt me during the reading, especially if the points that I'm making are not clear to you. I'm hoping that this will only take about 3/4 of an hour, we'll have to see, so that will give us plenty of time for discussion. In this paper, I shall first of all talk about the artist himself. I shall then describe the history of the main theme of the painting and its 3 principal characters. After looking at other characteristics of the painting, I shall end by looking at the relationship between the characters and the processes within the painting. Paolo Uccello was born in 1397 and died in 1475 at the age of 78. His real name was Paolo di Donno. Nobody knows why he changed his name. He was at first a goldsmith, and later, from about 1407 to 1414, he trained under the sculptor Ghiberti. He worked in Venice between 1425 and 1430 as a painter and a designer of mosaics. Not a great deal is known about him, but from his paintings, art historians note him for his preoccupation with geometry and perspective. Some have criticised him as being excessively concerned with these techniques, but they were excitingly new at the time, and clearly he was an unconventional painter trying to promote his ideas. It also seems to me that Uccello's interest in geometry was nowhere near as strong as it was in another artist of that time, Piero della Francesca, whose paintings I like, but they're very concerned with geometry. It could be said that some of the things that I shall say about this painting would have been beyond the knowledge of Uccello, but it is important to remember that he lived in a time when the dialogue between Christianity and pagan beliefs was very alive. Indeed, it is said that because Uccello drew attention to this dialogue, that the Christian Church often found him a provocative painter, since they preferred to eliminate the pagan beliefs by not naming them. For example, in the early 1460s, Uccello was commissioned to paint an altarpiece at Urbino. He started by painting the predella, which told the story of how a woman that had stolen a consecrated host from the church, which she gave to a man who dabbled in magic. This man tried to burn the host, which caused it to gush with blood. Although the story ended by the woman being hanged and the man being burned, the church found the painting about black magic unacceptable, so they took the commission away from Uccello, and the painting was finished by another artist. This painting, which was probably painted around 1460, again nobody knows with certainty, is in fact quite small, measuring 22¼ inches by 29¼ . The painting hangs in the National Gallery. It is seen by art historians as consisting of 2 episodes from the story of St. George. Firstly, his defeat of the dragon that had been terrorising the city, and secondly, the rescued princess bringing the dragon to heel by slipping her girdle around its neck. The city, in fact, is way in the distance. You can only just see it if you look really close. The story itself is taken from the popular book, The Golden Legend, which was first written in the 1200s, and is a collection of stories about the lives of saints. This was one of the first books printed by Caxton in 1483. Of course, the legend existed long before the 1200s, in a more primitive form, and Uccello would have most certainly known this. In some parts of Europe, for example, St. George was known as Green George, and the name in Greek means earth worker or farmer. We can therefore see that there is a strong relationship to the very ancient story of the Green Man, which was primarily a pagan ritual to appease the gods and thereby fertilize the earth following the winter. In the Golden Legend, we see another example of the well-known process of Christianity converting pagan beliefs into Christian stories. In the Golden Legend, one of the main themes of St. George is the rescuing of people by converting them to Christianity. In Jungian psychology, the themes of the warring opposites and the marriage of the opposites are the main dynamics of the self. The first episode in the painting is of the attack on the dragon by the hero, which depicts the struggle between Christian beliefs and pagan beliefs, chaos and order, good and evil, strong and weak, life and death. The second episode of the painting is the subduing of the dragon, whereupon it is harnessed to the girdle of the princess. In this way, the painting brings some of the opposites together, thereby forming a marriage. I would therefore suggest that this is a painting about some of the dynamics of growth. Looking at the setting of the painting, we can see by the moon, yes, you can't see it on that, the top of it's been clipped off, but there is a moon at the top of the painting. And by the bright light on the horizon, that it's all taking place at dawn. On this matter, Jung says, time is thus defined by the rising and setting sun, by the death and renewal of libido, the dawning and extinction of consciousness. End of quote. In other words, these dynamic themes are taking place outside the consciousness of daylight. This is further supported by the fact that the scene is taking place at some distance from the city, and if the city, with its defined wars and busy civilized life, could be seen as representing the ego. If we see the cave as representing the deep unconscious, then we could say that the main action of the painting is somewhere between the collective unconscious and nascent consciousness, that is to say, at the dawn of consciousness. We shall now look at the three main characters in the painting. Starting from the left-hand side of the painting, the first main figure that we come to is the maiden. She is no ordinary maiden, but is clearly a lady of high fashion. Apart from her fashionable dress, she also has the highbrow look. According to Tudor Craig, it was the custom in the 15th century for ladies with high status to shave their foreheads in order to give them an intelligent appearance, which would thus show their high standing. This, then, was a suitable match for our heroic knight. She is a good example of all the qualities that the feminine part, the anima, possesses. Namely, she is without aggression, i.e. innocent, tender, pure, patient, enduring, and seductive. These qualities have, of course, both a negative as well as a positive side. However, it is her ability to be patient and enduring that makes her a heroine, again a good match for the hero. As part of the whole, these qualities are of great asset to us all, but if we are possessed by them, then we become innocent victims who can only complain, usually in a whinging way. In such a state, we are always persecuted by villains, dragons, and waiting to be rescued by good, strong, assertive heroes. When we see patients in such a state, they tend to be constantly persecuted by many dragons, but their heroes never seem to me to be good enough. Although such people cannot be openly aggressive, there is never any shortage of covert hostility, of which they are completely unaware. As Jung observed, such a person has no feminine individuality, She is empty and merely glitters, a welcome vessel for the masculine projections." End of quote. I am aware that by trying to describe the anima, I may reduce her positive symbolic qualities. As Jung says, when therefore in dreams and other spontaneous products we meet with an unknown female figure whose significance oscillates between the extremes of a goddess and a whore, it is advisable to let her keep her independence and not reduce her arbitrarily to something known. If the unconscious shows her as an unknown, this attribute should not be got rid of by main force, with a view of arriving at a rational interpretation. End of quote. This needs to be kept in mind in relation to all my comments about the archetypal figures and themes that I see as being in the painting. The next main figure in the painting is the dragon. First of all, we notice that this is a two-legged dragon. Why should this be so? Jung says the dragon is in itself is a monstrum, a symbol combining the phonic principle of the serpent and the aerial principle of the bird. End of quote. In other words, these are the elements of earth and air. This dragon, then, combines the important opposites of the universe. We also notice that on the wings there are circles, which are white on top and red on the underside. I think that these circles represent eyes. Jung reminds us of the parable which says, "On this mountain lies the ever-waking dragon, who is called Pantothalmus, for he is covered with eyes on both sides of his body, before and behind, and he sleeps with some open and some closed." End of quote. The ever-watching nature of the beast adds considerably to its persecutory nature. The origin of the word persecute means to thoroughly follow. However, the most persecuting aspect of the dragon is the threat of being torn apart and devoured. We can see that Uccello's dragon has the necessary large teeth and mouth to carry out the evil deed. We can see that the similarity with fairy stories about witches who cook and eat their victims. What purpose then does such an image represent? Jung describes one answer. As the reader will long since have guessed, the dragon represents the negative mother imago, and thus expresses resistance to incest, or the fear of it. Dragon and snake are symbolic representations of the fear of the consequences of breaking the taboo and regressing to incest. End of quote. This would certainly accord with what we often see in the consulting room, namely that the fear frequently conceals the wish. Referring to the myth of Oedipus, Jung says that his killing of the Sphinx meant that Oedipus had not heeded the warning provided by the Sphinx, which is why he went on to commit incest. In fact, the Sphinx was created as a result of an incestuous union. Thus, seen from this point of view, the fearful nature of the dragon has a clear and positive meaning. Nevertheless, whilst the dragon takes the projections of the negative mother and the negative father, it is clear that the dragon contains both the masculine and feminine characteristics in a less differentiated state. Jung states, the dragon is said to impregnate himself. His tail is the masculine and his mouth the feminine organs. Thus we can see that the dragon represents the most primitive part of the self, the life force itself. In the painting, the dragon is in a state of rage because it is being threatened, I think. Throughout the world, the dragon represents the primitive elements, mostly in a state of turmoil. We might see this as standing for the primary instincts that are threatening to break out and to destroy our controlled lives. Because of this, we could interpret the hero as standing for our suppressing superego. On this matter, Jung says, the threat to one's inmost self from dragons and serpents points to the danger of the newly acquired consciousness being swallowed up again by the instinctive psyche, the unconscious." End of quote. Perhaps then we are looking at man's primitive nature in a state of destructive rage. We should not treat this possibility too lightly, since a modern and seemingly sophisticated version of this dragon would be an atomic bomb. It must be time to move to our hero then, who, like all good heroes, should come and rescue us all. Uccello's St. George is an interesting version. First of all, we notice that there are no signs of his being St. George. He is not displaying the St. George's cross in any way. This is surprising because Uccello painted his subjects on a number of times, and in an earlier version of this particular painting, the St. George figure clearly carried the St. George cross. We can also see that this picture, seeing the background of this picture, the figure of St. George consists of trees and the whirlwind. Being set against the trees and not having any sign of St. George gives weight to the idea that Uccello was linking the figure of St. George with the green man. The green man is associated with earth, matter and mortality, and the whirlwind is associated with sky, spirit and immortality. Whirlwinds, of course, are connected with the life-bringing Numen, the spirit, the breath of life. The seed is carried by the wind and in this way fertilizes Mother Earth. It seems to me then that in his painting Uccello has brought these two sets of qualities together, in that the whirlwind is touching the trees, and in this way the hero is a combination figure. Either way, it is the qualities of the hero that are clearly demonstrated. In contrast to the innocence of the maid, the hero is active, thrusting, assertive, penetrating, and perhaps most important of all, he is able to give full expression to his aggression. However, unlike the dragon, the hero's aggression is expressed in the name of a good cause. Thus, in this way, both the maid and the hero deny their destructive aggression. It is the destructive aggression that is in the shadow of the hero, and in this part it is projected into the dragon. As I've already said, our heroic part can be a great asset when the external situation calls for it, especially when the rest of our personality is also able to influence us. However, those who are over-identified with the hero need to be watched. It has been observed that those who are inclined to be criminals during peacetime often become heroes during the war. The qualities of ruthlessness and open aggression are seen as bravery during the war, but during peacetime these qualities are less socially acceptable. There is also the danger that during difficult economic periods a political hero may come to the fore, as Hitler did in Germany in the 30s. Then, of course, immigrants are frequently seen as the dragons who need to be eliminated. The virtues of nationalism always need to be considered along with its costs. On a personal level, the task is clear. The shadow needs to be integrated. The hero in us, who takes on a near godlike image, has to be transformed into a human. That is no easy task, but I shall come back to this later. I do not see the horse in the painting as a separate character, because I think that it is very much part of the hero. Referring to the horse, Jung says, as an animal, it represents the non-human psyche, the subhuman animal side, the unconscious. And more to the point, Jung also says, the hero and his horse seem to symbolize the idea of man and the subordinate sphere of animal instinct. End of quote. Because of its links with the instincts and the unconscious, the horse is clearly an important asset for the hero when dealing with the dragon, who of course comes from the underworld. There are plenty of examples in folklore connecting horses with sexuality, and there can be no doubt that Uccello's hero, although very young, is a virile match for the seductive maid. With regard to the cave in the painting, as I've already said, from a psychological point of view, is very much part of the Great Mother and is therefore the womb of the unconscious. Regarding the meaning of the legend of the cave in the Quran, Jung says, anyone who gets into the cave, that is to say, into the cave which everyone has in himself, or into the darkness that lies beyond consciousness, will find himself involved in, at first, unconscious process of transformation. By penetrating into the unconscious, he makes a connection with his unconscious contents. This may result in a momentous change of the personality in the positive or negative sense." End of quote. With this in mind, we can see that since the action of the painting is taking place at the entrance of the cave, the theme of the painting is concerned with the processes of transformation. That is to say, we are witnessing the personality in the process of losing its existing identity, and by so doing, gaining a new identity. This can be very frightening and is at best uncomfortable, as we can see in the painting. We can see that the main action of the painting is taking place on greenery arranged in the shape of a maze. The meaning of the maze in psychology is showing the warring opposites of chaos and order. The careful and orderly way in which it is laid out conveys a sense of order, but within this order we can suffer the chaotic experience of being lost. It is a journey to the centre. The maze is a journey to the centre. The centre is a representation of the centre of our personality, the self. Again we see the themes of losing and finding ourselves in the process of life's journey as part of giving birth to a new self. This is also, there is also, of course, the possibility of everlasting chaos, of our becoming lost souls, but there is no gain without risk. It is interesting to observe the way in which the hero's lance forms a direct line between the eye of the whirlwind and the eye of the dragon. This might be seen as divine intervention which is helping the hero in his battle against evil, and it is possible that this is what Uccello had in mind. However, I would suggest that even if this was Uccello's intention, what is actually conveyed is how the struggle between good and evil is not always helped by the actions of the hero part, because the masculine part is not concerned with relationship, but with resolution by the use of force. Here again, we see that neither the masculine nor the feminine have the answer on their own, but by way of the marriage of these opposites, the individual can achieve a great deal. The reason being that then and only then, the individual has all the characteristics needed to cope with the demands and conflicts of internal and external worlds. We shall now move into looking at the relationships between these three characters. In order to make sense of the possible meanings in this painting, I think that it is necessary for us to remind ourselves of the growth processes involved in the development of the personality. Looking at these processes from a Jungian point of view and stating them very briefly, the potential qualities of the individual's constitution are slowly unpacked by way of the individual's relationship with the outside world, in particular in relation to the individual's parents. This unpacking is carried out by way of the process of deintegration and reintegration as described by Ford. don't despair, I'll give you an example. If we take the characteristics of assertiveness and anger in the infant, then I think that we start with a primitive impulse to act, which is brought about by the deintegrating needs. These needs destroy the status quo, and if the impulse is strong enough, then it may lead to some kind of action. When the result of this action is satisfaction, then the experience is integrated, and following many similar experiences, the more sophisticated aspects of assertiveness become a usable asset of the personality. When, however, the action results in frustration, then I think we see the reactive characteristic of anger. The purpose of this would seem to be to remove the frustration, but this purpose evokes many complicated emotions. The ruthless rage, which in the infant is capable of murder at a fantasy level, creates a fear that the frustrating parent will retaliate, either by attacking back or by abandoning the infant. Thus the infant feels that it is too dangerous to own the anger and projects it into the parent, who then looks very frightening. Looking now at our painting, we can see that the relationship between the maiden and the dragon begins to take on a clearer meaning. Taken from this point of view, the dragon could be seen as the parent who is carrying the inhuman amount of extreme rage which has been projected by the maid. The more innocent the maid tries to be, the greater is the danger of the dragon. When such a strong specialization occurs, then we see a relationship that can never come to an end, because no child can separate without first integrating their capacity to be angry as part of their enabling aggression. In this part of the painting, we see a very good portrait of the nature of sadomasochism. The maid with her helplessness and the dragon with its sadistic power have all they need for an exciting and everlasting trap. This, then, is where the heroic part of our nature can play an important role, because as soon as we are able to confront the parental imago, then the dragon figure immediately begins to shrink. Jung says of this, "The treasure which the hero fetches from the dark cavern is life, it is himself, new-born from the dark maternal cave of the unconscious, where he was stranded by the introversion or regression of libido. The hero who clings to the mother is the dragon, and when he is reborn from the mother, he becomes the conqueror of the dragon." End of quote. Thus we can see that in this sense the hero plays a transforming function for the personality. However, having achieved this position, it should be noticed that it is the maid who harnesses the dragon. This fits in with the idea that it is the feminine part of our personality that values relationship and is concerned with bringing things together. This drama can easily be seen in this painting. Firstly, the way in which the frightened maid part of us is trapped by the terrifying dragon part, and secondly, by how the heroic part does battle with the dragon and leads the hero with the maid, bringing the dragon to heel. That is to say, because the aggression has been integrated, it can now be a usable asset. Notice also in the painting how the murderous wish of the hero has modified down to inflicting a wound, and how the trapped maiden has developed her ensnaring abilities by placing her girdle around the dragon's neck. Thus the hero and the maiden are not just into eliminating the dragon, but bringing it under control. This unique idea of Uccello's seems to symbolize the personality bringing the primitive power of the impulses into its use. However, this seems to me to be only a stage in the spiral of development. Having reintegrated the aggressive part, and thereby reducing the power of the parent, leaves us within the cosy, symbolic, incestuous relationship with the parent. This is certainly one of the paradoxes that is presented to us by the hero and the heroine parts. At first it looks as if we are back to where we started. Nevertheless, the satisfaction and gratification that has been achieved can give us the strength to use the real advantages of the maiden part. Looking at the relationship between the maiden and the dragon, Jung says, "The annual sacrifice of the maiden to the dragon is perhaps an ideal sacrifice on a mythological level. In order to mollify the wrath of the terrible mother, the most beautiful girl was sacrificed as a symbol of man's concupiscence. By sacrificing these valued objects of desire and possession, the instinctive desire, or libido, is given up in order that it may be regained in a new form." End of quote. In other words, in order to gain our independence, we have to sacrifice some of our yearnings for the parent, and at a later date find anew those yearnings in relation to someone outside the family. It is, of course, the qualities of surrender, sadness, and patience that enable us to take this step. In other words, to bring about the marriage of the opposites, some of the extreme aspects of specialization with its overdetermined goals have to be sacrificed. This to oversimplify the two stages in the painting, they can be summarized as the warring opposites and the marriage of the opposites. And this is the drama that is involved with the development of each and every human characteristic, and with each and every potential that we bring out of our constitution. This is the process that goes on until the grave and probably beyond. Seeing the painting in this way shows how inventive Uccello was, because most paintings of St. George and the Dragon show only one stage, the killing of the dragon, whereas Uccello's painting tells us about a process. It is the process of growth brought about by the creative change. The example I gave is about assertive aggression, but it is important to also point out the obvious sexual struggle in the painting, which involves the same process of growth that I have already described. We could see the purity and innocence of the maid as standing for sexual desire of the masculine, which, as with aggression, has to be rescued from the dragon mother. And we can see how the maiden is being rescued. At this stage, it is not possible to talk of sacrifice, because you can only sacrifice that which you have once possessed. Thus, in this picture, we see the masculine part fighting for his sexuality, which is still located in the terrible mother. In the clinical setting, we sometimes see a patient who has not won this battle, or more accurately, the mother has not valued the sexuality in the child by way of having positive symbolic incest with the child, i.e. loving it. When the love is limited in this way, then we see an everlasting battle with the terrible mother, and a person who can only admire at a distance somebody who is a reflection of that part of themselves, which I believe is the case with many forms of sexual perversion. A relevant quotation from Jung states, "The dragon in the cave is the terrible mother." In German legend, the maiden in distress often appears as a snake or dragon and has to be kissed. Then it changes into a beautiful woman. End of quote. The meaning of this is constantly presented to us in our analytic experience. When there is a piece of difficult behavior or antisocial symptom, then it is necessary for us to get into a relationship with it in order to discover its meaning and purpose. With this understanding, we may gain we can sometimes help the patient to convert this troublesome energy into a creative asset of their personality. As Redfern implies, the devouring mother is the deprived child within. However, in relation to sexual identity, I think that there is a more important way of looking at the painting, which I would like to spell out. Hopefully not too long. It seems to me that the painting portrays the primitive feminine and the primitive masculine, or in Jungian terms, the anima and the animus. It is my belief that the man and the woman both have these innate qualities, and indeed both Freud and Jung saw the newborn child as being bisexual. As the individual grows, we see both internal and external forces playing a part in sexual identity of the individual. For example, the boy, because of his constitutional makeup and the influences of the environment, may first develop his masculine characteristics, which tend to remain the most influential, and then later his feminine characteristics. If a man is possessed by the masculine characteristic, then we see someone who is behaving in a stereotyped way, that is, overly aggressive, sadistic, dominating, etc. If he is possessed by his feminine side, then he will be overly passive, submissive, masochistic, etc. This is exactly the same for a woman when she is possessed. The important thing to note that being either a man or a woman involves the integration of both characteristics, not in equal proportions, but containing at least some of both. Whenever the individual is possessed by either, then we no longer see a man or a woman, but a caricature of the primitive masculine or the primitive feminine parts. It is therefore the marriage of the masculine and feminine parts that result in our male or female identity. What we also see when the person is possessed by the masculine or feminine parts is that they either devalue or overvalue the opposite aspect. Of course, since such opposition is essentially an internal conflict, it inevitably results in such a person diminishing themselves. In other words, we cannot denigrate either the masculine or the feminine without diminishing both, because they belong to each other. They are two halves of a whole. It is possible that whichever characteristic developed first remains the most influential characteristic in the individual's eventual sexual identity. If, therefore, a boy first develops his feminine side, then this side tends to remain dominant in his identity, and this may play a strong part in the identity of a homosexual. Similarly, when a girl first develops her masculine side, then this may result in a lesbian identity. In relation to this, it is important to emphasize that both constitutional as well as environmental factors play a part in the development of our identity, and these influences are probably more important than the timing of the emerging identity. I also wish to make clear that I am not saying that homosexuals are possessed by the feminine side, but the feminine side is the more dominant characteristic in their makeup. The differences between dominance and possession is that with dominance both characteristics exist and are valued, but one characteristic is used more than the other. Whereas with possession, the one characteristic is opposed to the other and aims to eliminate the other altogether. Of course, homosexuals and lesbians may be possessed by either characteristic, and this adds to the whole range of sexual identities. Jung implied that no man can converse with an animus-possessed woman for more than 5 minutes without becoming a victim of his own anima. I would see this as only being likely if the man is possessed by his anima, and this may result in a partnership where we see a dominant woman with a passive man. In my experience, the more likely problem is that when a man converses with an animus-possessed woman, he is likely to become a victim of his own animus. Then we see, as it were, two fighting cocks. Regarding the concepts of the anima and the animus, although I have used them as if they are the same as feminine and masculine, this in fact is not the case. The anima and the animus are not, and cannot be, so clearly defined. They are part of our collective unconscious, and as such, they only suggest and imply feminine and masculine characteristics. They are potentials rather than well-developed states. It is also the case that whilst some people seem to be possessed for long periods, the more common experience is for people to be possessed for short periods of time, usually when they are under stress. I also think that it is important to say that I do not see the animus and the anima in a man as being the same as the anima and the animus in a woman. Being in a different chemical environment inevitably results in more subtle differences between the two. I think that the animus in a man tends to be better differentiated than the animus in a woman. Similarly, I think that the anima in a woman is better differentiated than the anima in a man. For this reason, I think that same-sex relationships play an important part in the development of the individual's anima and the animus parts. This is the case because, for example, it is easier for a man to identify with another man's animus because of the similarity. After this, it is usual for him to go on to develop his anima in relation to a woman. However, it is the integration of both the anima and the animus that results in the identity of a man or a woman. All of this development is part of a lengthy process of self-realization. It seems to me that Uccello's painting is more about the anima and the animus than anything more clearly defined. I see the basic struggle between the anima and the animus, as well as its resolution, as being in the painting. It is a struggle that has gone on throughout time, and evermore shall be so. By way of summary, I should like to give a long quotation from Jung and a short clinical example. Jung says, "The battle is fought out between the dominant and the contents of the unconscious so violently that reason would like to clamp down on unreason. But these attempts fail and go on failing until the ego acknowledges its impotence and lets the furious battle of the psychic powers go its own way. If the ego does not interfere with its irritating rationality, the opposites, just because they are in conflict, will gradually draw together, and what looked like death and destruction will settle down into a latent state of concord, suitably expressed by the symbol of pregnancy." End of quote. I shall now give a simple but actual account of a marital problem that is very obviously an example of our picture, but can be seen in more subtle ways in many marriages. This couple came to me complaining about the behaviour of each. Each cited the other as selfish, and each saw themselves as blameless. That is, innocent, without destructive motive or action. They both saw their marriage as having been very good to begin with. In fact, they actually said that they had had a fairy tale honeymoon. As part of telling me about the beginnings of their relationship, the wife said that she had lived at home with her mother. At this point, they both became almost animated, and certainly united, in their description of the wife's mother. They said that the mother was nasty, possessive, denigrating, and destructive. The wife's father had been quite an assertive man, but he had died many years before, which may have accounted to some extent for the possessive nature of the mother. The wife at that time felt unable to stand up. The wife that I was seeing felt unable to stand up to her mother, and this was still the case to some extent. The husband, on the other hand, had been able to assert himself, and he had had many rows with the mother. Before their marriage, most of the rows between the wife and her mother had been about the mother's dislike of the boyfriend, and in particular the way he kept her out late at night. It was soon clear that both the husband and the wife saw the mother as the dragon. This, of course, is typical, I should say stereotypical, view of the mother-in-law, whom I see as frequently carrying the destructive aggression of many men and many daughters. Of course, whilst the mother was playing an active part in their relationship, he saw his wife as being all sweetness and light, and she saw him as the rescuing hero. Within 6 months of their marriage, however, each began to see the other as being the dragon. With this couple, we can see how each of them had denied their destructive impulses, which placed these impulses into their shadow. As is inevitable, they then projected the contents of their shadow into the mother, which bound them to her in a particular way, and at the same time brought them together also in a particular way. Only by owning their destructive wishes and thereby learning about its value would it be possible for them to take back what was rightly theirs. In terms of our painting, we can see how their dragon, with its creative as well as destructive capacities, had not been brought to heel or integrated. From our comfortable position as observers, it is easy for us to see the folly of such marriages. But which of us is keen to see that our most creative work is simultaneously an act of destruction? And as such, it may be the case that the cost is not worth the benefit. Although it is obvious that every creative act destroys, because at the very least it destroys the status quo, this is still an idea that we have difficulty in accommodating with our conscious mind. Only very recently have we begun to accept what human creativity is doing to our environment. But even with this, we tend to see it as being done by those over there rather than what we ourselves are doing. This painting tells us about this internal and external struggle of creation and destruction. It is, in other words, a portrait of each of us.